Last November, you may remember I attended the Children's Health Defense Annual Conference in Austin, and I was able to connect with so many medical freedom activists and dissidents and so many people who are still concerned. Yeah, COVID's been gone, I guess, for a while, but are still very concerned that we need answers. And to that end, they have created the COVID Index, which we're going to talk about today. Nathaniel Mead, MSc, PhD, is a public health research scientist and McCullough Foundation scholar. Since the late 1990s, he has authored over 55 peer-reviewed scientific papers, contributed to numerous books, served as an editor for 2 peer-reviewed scientific journals, and worked as an integrative medicine research consultant. Mead is also the lead author on several peer-reviewed papers on the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines, co-authored with Drs. Peter McCullough, Stephanie Seneff, Jessica Rose, Paul Marik, William Makis, and other notable scientists. For those of you who are steeped in COVID dissident docs, as am I, you will know those names and you will be thrilled to hear what Dr. Mead has to say about what we can still do. For those of us who aren't willing to forget, we're willing to forgive because God calls us to, but we are not going to forget what happened, because when we forget what happened, then we are setting ourselves up to have something like this happen again. And I'm so thrilled that there are doctors and researchers and activists who are not going to let this go. And one of them is here to join us today. Welcome to Love and Life. I'm Dr. Karen Anderson Abril, here with my co-host,
Pastor Elliot Anderson.
And Love and Life is your place to hear conversations grounded in psych research, psychotherapy,
and biblical truth
to help us thrive in love and life. Dr. Mead, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Karen. It's great to be here.
Yeah, this is such a heavy and I feel at times overwhelming topic. And what you are doing with COVID Index, which you're going to explain to everyone what that is and what it's all about and how it hopes to help what we've all been through. But our community at Love and Life knows full well where Elliot and I stood on COVID, and where I personally, as a psychologist, have been a dissident in the field for many years as we see the regulatory capture, of course, FDA. I'm of the mindset now I can't trust them whatsoever. In fact, whatever they recommend, I'm going to do the opposite at this point. And of course, how that has infiltrated their approval of so many psychotropics, which then has become, in many cases, the first course of action for mental health, a variety of realms and a variety of conditions. So this is something as a psychologist has been very personal to me. And then our community knows how I was a COVID dissident and then was, during those very, very dark days, looking for any professionals, scientists, biologists, and certainly medical professionals who were willing to speak out. And as you know, and as you experienced, the censorship and the vilification and the losing of licenses and all the things. Our community is quite well aware of how I'm personally still very angry. I know that's something I have to work on in my heart with God, but I am also demoralized. I would say probably isn't too strong a word. It's heartened, certainly, that as Americans, where we were raised to believe that we were the rugged pioneers and we were going to fight any kind of establishment authoritarianism. I didn't see a lot of that. So as you are having moved through the exact same years of, I would say, tyranny that we all have, and that brings you to this place. So I'd love to hear your background, how you experienced what you went through and how that led you to be part of the COVID Index and what that means for all of us other dissidents who are still feeling just really, really like the ground has kind of shaken beneath us and not really sure how to get our bearings moving forward.
Yeah, I think what's most important to say right from the outset is that I too have been shocked by the lack of critical thinking around the government's response to the whole drama that was created. It was really clear to me right from the outset that there was a lot that was being fabricated because we heard right in the beginning that the infection fatality rate for COVID was 0.2% for the whole population. So when you break that down into segments of the population, you find out that the younger people had an infection fatality rate of 0.003%, which is basically 0%. So it wasn't a threat to the younger segments of the population. And you see this kind of strange disjunction between the fact of the 0.2% for the whole population and the sudden amplification of messaging around, the deaths,
Mm-hmm.
that this is a serious threat. This is a major risk to our survival. I mean, all kinds of dramatic statements that were completely at odds with the basic number that Anthony Fauci himself was sharing with the public. So it was kind of like, are we just completely scientifically illiterate, bereft of any common sense, to see that this very small risk, which was being, mainly focused on the elderly population and those with multiple comorbid diseases like obesity and heart disease and diabetes, that those people were considered to be very much at risk. So I was really shocked by the level of obvious distortion and exaggeration that was happening right from the beginning. It almost seemed, it was surreal for me because I studied a lot of psychology over the years. And in fact, when I was a kid, I read almost all of Carl Jung's books. I still have most of them. Wilhelm Reich, even Freud, although I think Freud was kind of a nutcase. But, what I was seeing psychologically was this kind of immediate, what RFK Jr. calls appeals to authority, where people were just going, the experts say this, the government says this, the news media says this, so why are you saying something different from what everybody else is saying? And so it was so clear that it was a consensus-based, fabricated reality that was being thrust upon the population. And because it was so incredibly well orchestrated with such an amazing homogenization of the messaging, especially when the COVID shots rolled around and you had suddenly everybody saying safe and effective, when there was really no good data to support that, I felt like I was witnessing something that, I know it's going to be a little bit edgy to say this, but very similar to what happened to the German population prior to World War II Nazi Germany, when Goebbels, the communications or propaganda minister, gifted radios to all of the population of Berlin and other cities, throughout Germany, and then proceeded to say this message about the Jewish people, that they were the cause of all the suffering of the Germans and that they were causing the economic downfall and all this. So they basically, through that constant messaging, created this environment where people would accept a lie. And I think we saw the same thing happen. In fact, it was really kind of eerie to see the parallels, because suddenly the unvaccinated, it became a so-called pandemic of the unvaccinated, which was marginalizing this group of people that simply were skeptical about having shots pushed on them, which is what happened. It was largely coercion, because especially for the young people, if you didn't accept the shots, you couldn't go to college, you couldn't have certain jobs, you couldn't even go to certain events, social events. You were blocked from visiting elderly family members. I mean, it was so bizarre, and it was such an outright lie from a from a biologically and medically accurate point of view, that these shots were never safe and effective. So that's how I initially kind of got pulled in. It was a health show, and the show was about the immune system, and I had written about the immune system quite a lot, and about the nutritional factors and lifestyle factors, stress and so forth, how they impact the immune system. And I had written a book, I think it was published in 1990. It was about natural immunity and nutrition and lifestyle factors. So when I was about to get on the show, they said, okay, you just have one condition. You cannot mention the words vaccine or vaccination on the show. And I thought, wait a minute, don't we live in the United States? I thought we lived in the United States. What are you saying?
Right.
What about free speech? And these are just words. What if I said vaccines are good? They said, no, you can't mention the word because it's too polarizing. We can't mention it. Vaccine or vaccination, no, you can't do it. Immunization, no, you can't talk about it. I said, but this is about the immune system. We're talking about what if I want to talk about ways to complement the vaccination or maybe make it even safer, which I never would have done. But I was trying to, find out. And it was just basically, they said, if you do this, we will be shut down. And so I said, okay, well, and I almost refused to go on the show, but what it did is it lit a fire under me and I started to write papers. I conceived of a paper that eventually became a whole series that Dr. Peter McCullough loved and immediately said, I want to co-author on this. And then I brought in other co-authors that had high profiles like Stephanie Seneff and Jessica Rose and brought in Steve Kirsch and a few others that, are pretty provocative voices. Actually, William Makis came in on one of the papers. But I basically applied my skills as a science writer, which I had done, wrote a lot of papers for the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is part of the NIH. And I've always been really good at synthesizing information and bringing together what I consider to be really critical information to making an argument that in this case, it was in the initial series of papers, we were looking at the clinical trials that were done, which were, even if, from a basic common sense point of view, and I remember talking with my mother about this, and she had no science training at all, but she immediately got it. I said, the clinical trials were 2 to 3 months long, and the typical time frame for testing vaccines was 10 to 15 years prior to that. So what they did is they created the semblance of an emergency in order to get these things, these genetic products, these synthetic modified mRNA injections approved as, quote, vaccines for the population. And because the population had been so programmed to think of vaccines as safe and effective for decades, it was fairly easy to do that. And the left, the Democratic side, bought it hook, line, and sinker because the vaccine ideology has always been that, you are protecting the population by taking this. So even Fauci kept saying, this really drove me crazy. He kept saying, this is going to speed up getting to herd immunity. And first he said 50% needs to be vaccinated. Then he said 50%, then 70, kept going higher and higher. Pretty soon it was 90%. And then it was suddenly like, we all got to get the shots because that's the only way, right? But what he wasn't saying, which is really important for people to understand, is that these shots were causing serious immune dysfunction. And by doing so, they were actually preventing herd immunity. We would have reached herd immunity much sooner if and herd immunity simply means that you're no longer transmitting the virus in a way that's causing disease and suffering. And so it's a stabilization where you coexist with the virus, but it's no longer a threat. It's basically contained and it's no longer doing anything that's causing anything serious in terms of death. So we would have reached it much sooner if we had done what Sweden did initially, and allowing their population to mingle freely and not, putting them in lockdowns. Unfortunately, Sweden then made a huge mistake and vaccinated the living daylights out of their population. I should say injected because it's not really vaccinated.
Yeah, right.
And they injected their population heavily after they had really they were on a trajectory to achieving herd immunity in a very efficient way. But now, unfortunately, in Sweden and in many other countries that were extensively injected with these products, these synthetic mRNA products, what you see is excess mortality in 2022, 2023, and 2024 in the most heavily vaccinated countries. And so we have documented that. Edward Dowd's group, Finance Technologies, which is based in Portugal, has documented it. Many others have documented it as well. And this is, in fact, the only studies that don't really show this are the ones that are financed by Bill Gates and the vaccine enterprise, which is one of the biggest segments of the pharmaceutical industry, the largest industry on the planet now. And so those studies that contradict what I'm saying about excess mortality in 2022, 2023, and 24, and keep in mind that these are the years that Omicron was considered a relatively benign entity. It was not supposed to, it was often compared to the common cold, but when you add the immune dysfunction caused by the mRNA shots, you get what I have started calling hybrid harms. And so I wrote a paper about this, which is about the synergistic interaction between the COVID shots and COVID. And so then you get an amplification, and that's what's causing the excess mortality in the heavily vaccinated countries. Because what happens is, and you can see this especially in the most heavily injected countries, which are the Asian countries, because the Asian countries are the ones that conform the most. The people conform to their government, mostly because of coercion that's extreme, but Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, which is not a country, but, it's a region that is like a country because it's so heavily populated. They all showed extremely high excess mortality, the highest in the world, and they had the highest injection rates in the world. And what's interesting is that you can see that there are correlations with the COVID. So that even in 2022 and 2023, you could see waves of COVID being correlated with all-cause mortality. So what did the governments do? Well, they said, look, COVID's still a threat. You got to get more shots. We got to keep those shots going. And so now the illusion is even stronger, because you have these COVID waves corresponding with all-cause mortality. And so people are saying, well, yeah, look, COVID is driving all-cause mortality, without even thinking about the background effect, which is, the fact that the population is extensively injected with these mRNA products, which are really drugs. And I'll just say this, because I know I'm rambling, and you have psychology training. So I think this is a really interesting point to make, is that if these things had been called drugs at the outset, which they are, they're essentially pro-drugs, because they you put the genetic program in the body, and then it pumps out a protein that you want to produce. So that's what a prodrug is. And that production of the protein, which is the spike protein, which is highly toxic and causes inflammation and immune dysfunction, especially in combination with the lipid nanoparticles that are used as the vehicle to get it into all the cells of the body. If you had said this is a drug from the outset, and honestly said this is an experimental drug, we've never, ever given it on a population-wide basis, ever, a genetic product, we've never done this in the history of humankind. And now we have billions of people who are injected with something that is still in their bodies, because we have evidence that it stays in the body at least 3 years. And that's just because the observation period is 3 years. It probably goes even longer. I seriously doubt that the population would have gone for it if Fauci had said, by the way, this is an experimental drug. But when he called it a vaccine, everything changed. Yeah.
Well, and even if it had worked as it was purported to work, isn't this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that if you do a mass vaccination campaign during an outbreak, you just encourage the virus to mutate to another version, which we saw anyway. And so then that initial vaccine, now you're treating people to prevent a version of the virus that's no longer even out. Now we have the Omicron, like you said, it kept changing. We had the Alpha, and then I don't remember it seemed like go ahead.
Dr. Ryan Cole called this whack-a-mole.
Yes. And again, I say that knowing that it wasn't a vaccine. It was, I've heard it described as a gene therapy. Maybe that is not accurate, but it's closer than a vaccine, I would say. But so even if it had worked as it was promised to work, it wouldn't have been the right approach anyway. And so with your background and having been around scientists and medical types and people in these professions, it must have been so jarring for you to go, wait, where's all this? We are steeped in this understanding of how biology or whatever field of science one is in. But there is certain, like the basic thing you told your mother, which again, this is like scientific method 101 that everyone should have taken and like by high school at the latest, is that you do a trial, but you think about a longitudinal study that lets you know, because this new product that you're putting into people or people are ingesting or whatever, we don't know the results. Maybe there were no results for 3 months, 3 years. But what about 15 years later? And isn't there a clip of Fauci talking about this very thing? Well, it might look like there's no problem. And then 10 years later, you find out there is. So even little things like that. I just remember looking at my husband when they started talking about this. I was like, well, you can't warp speed any kind of new product. Are you kidding me? You need 10 to 12 years minimum before we know if it's even close to safe.
Right. Because by definition, you're not seeing any long-term effects. And then you're capitalizing off of the vaccine industry's need to not show adverse effects because, first of all, they use a very healthy population as their sample, which is interesting because everyone's saying we got to protect the elderly and the people with comorbidities, right? They were not part of the trial. So we're looking at a healthy population. And so you're going to see a minimization of adverse effects because it's what we call healthy vaccinee bias. But then at the same time, the clinical trials were so poorly done. They were, for example, they had close to 400 people in the Pfizer trial that were never accounted for. They were called lost to follow-up. I wonder what happened. I mean, even if 10 of those people died, it would have dramatically changed the calculus of risk benefit because it was already the CDC or was the FDA, I think it was the FDA, that 23% there was a 23% higher mortality in the vaccine group than in the placebo group. But it was actually 31%. When you looked at it more carefully, it was a 31% higher mortality. This didn't come out until after the emergency use authorization. And then on top of that, there was a 4-fold higher serious cardiac event percentage in the vaccinated versus placebo. And I should be putting vaccinated quotes every time because we're talking about genetic products. But the point there is that this all came out afterwards. And when data was reanalyzed and presented back to the FDA pretended as if they were interested, but then ignored it completely and never shared it with the public. So the media never shared it because, of course, the media is unfortunately so controlled now by the pharmaceutical industry. I used to think it was just certain like news networks, like CNN, which is, about as transparently pro, it's like advertising for the pharmaceutical industry, but it's really the whole media. It's National Public Radio, it's New York Times, it's Washington Post, it's the Reuters, it's the Associated Press. They're all completely, and this capture of the media creates this ongoing propaganda machine. And we saw it just now with the new guidelines for vaccines, which you probably heard about, which is really an incredible accomplishment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Huge.
I mean, it's really one of the greatest things that's ever happened for public health is reducing the number of vaccines. I think it's from 17 to 11 or something. And then the doses have been reduced by about 55 doses, which is just mind blowing. And that's going to translate into fewer cases of autism and other things.
Well, and the other element to this that has been really disheartening for me is to see, so speaking of the propaganda and then the politicization of all of this. So to the point now where we talk about the childhood vaccine schedule and we've got young people having babies and depending on their politics, that is a huge factor because even though RFKJ is Democrat royalty, he's now MAGA, according to many people. If he works with Trump in any way, shape or form, he is now hanging out with Hitler. So whatever he recommends is going to be dismissed. So that's what's so, And again, there's the propaganda and it's the media, and they're going to spin it this way, and they're going to make him look like a freak instead of a dissident, an OG dissident who started out as an environmental lawyer, by the way, cleaning up the Hudson River, which is supposedly a lefty cause. I mean, you and I have lived long enough to see many of the ideology that was once very much the left's is now considered right wing. It's mind boggling to experience this.
He was a hero of the left until he started to align with, until he started to, go off in his own direction. And then he joined up with Trump. And that was, of course, the ultimate sin.
Yeah. Just forget it. Yeah.
From the liberal point of view. But RFK Jr. is the greatest gift, I think, to our government that we've ever had. Frankly, I mean, not just in terms of public health, but in terms of a voice. And when I say ever have, I mean like in recent years, because he's so incredibly on target with everything that he's talked about. I mean, fluoride, pesticides, children's health, and on every level. And parents should be celebrating in the streets about RFK being in there, because everything he's doing, and he's so incredibly articulate and scientifically literate that I'll bet you that no PhD or high level scientist could get in a debate with him and win the debate on vaccines and on a lot of environmental health issues. He would blow them out of the water because he's so well read and so deeply grounded in all of the topics. I had the really great fortune of speaking with him once for 33 minutes, and I'll never forget it. It was one of the peak experiences back in 2023. But, I think, so you and I had talked before the show about the COVID index, which is an incredible resource. And the reason I got so interested in it initially was because I was at the receiving end of a censorship campaign by the pharmaceutical industry, which happened after we published our first big paper, Lessons Learned, which was published in the journal Curious, the Journal of Medical Science. And 30 days after the publication, we were retracted suddenly. And that means that, you get this stamp of retraction on PubMed, and it's sort of like it's supposed to be a stain on your career. But we took it as a red badge of honor because there was so much censorship happening that we kind of anticipated. In fact, Dr. McCullough and I were on a show the night before we got the letter from the publisher. And the last thing I said on the show was, please download the paper as much as you can, because I have a feeling we're about to get retracted. And the reason I said that was because we had been trying to correspond with the editors about a certain issue on the paper. I think it was a formatting issue, and they weren't responding for a whole week. And so I suddenly I had this intuition that, something was about to happen. And this was after 330,000 downloads of the paper, where this journal, Curious, the average number of downloads in a single year, 12 months as opposed to the 1 month that we had, was 2,170. So we had 330,000 in 30 days, and the average was 2,170 in a year. We knew that we were getting too much attention from the pharmaceutical industry's point of view. And that's what has happened is if you get too much attention that is going to damage their bottom line, you're going to have to deal with this retraction issue, which is unethical, it's unwarranted, and often predatory in the sense that they know in advance that they're probably going to do it. I mean, journals like The Lancet are the worst. If you ever hear The Lancet, British Medical Journal, if you ever hear it being used as it is right now by CNN and MSNBC and everything to support the safe and effective narrative around vaccines, are, doing it now very strongly. And The Lancet is the worst journal because it's used to be one of the best. It used to be that you wanted to get published in Lancet. Now it's just only if you want to really get more funding from the pharmaceutical industry for your research, because they will give you more money if you get published in The Lancet. It's so corrupt. It's beyond belief.
Well, for those of us who have a background in research, as a psychologist, when I was a full-time professor, I wouldn't say anything in the classroom that I didn't have a citation. You just don't say anything unless you have that research background, or citation to back up your statement or your theory or whatever you're going for. But now I'm in the place where I don't trust any of these journals that used to be the gold standard and top tier. So where does that leave us in the community? Who do we trust? Because it's very jarring to have lived and operated, like you talked about earlier, have thought through concerns, issues from a critically hoping through a lens of critical thinking, knowing that the research is part of that before you inform your opinion or determine your opinion. And now I'm left in this very uncomfortable space of going, I certainly don't trust any governmental agencies. I don't trust many of the journals I thought I could trust, probably most, including in the psych realm too. It's not just in the types of medical journals you're talking about. I'm now to the point where I don't know, say, call someone an expert. I'm also immediately suspect. How did you get that job? Who did you placate and appease and suck up to get that position? So we're left in this very frontier, Wild West of just how do we trust anything? And I guess that gets us back to the COVID index. This is an effort to try to provide something for those of us out here kind of grasping at straws for what we can trust.
Yeah, the COVID index is it's a great resource. It's a large searchable repository of articles of all kinds, peer-reviewed, retracted articles, legal documents, and things that were obtained through the FOIA request. By the way, the Pfizer paper is an amazing resource as well. Naomi Wolf, who is also a great example of somebody like RFK in the sense that she went through a complete mischaracterization and demonization, much like RFK. But the Pfizer papers complement the COVID index. The COVID index is, so it's covidindex.science. It is easily searchable, thousands of articles, and Children's Health Defense helped launch the site with funding and providing guidance. The site is very easy to navigate, and so I think it's going to be a helpful tool, for historical purposes, because it does document so many things that were part of the censorship campaign that happened during the last 5 years, especially the first 4, where we saw so many scientists' voices being suppressed. And it's really hard to it's one thing to have political figures' voices suppressed. And I don't mean to say that politicians are less than scientists or anything like that. What I'm saying is that science has typically been one of those areas where you expect open, free discourse. So in a lot of ways, it's probably the best example of where you want free speech protected, because the scientific method is designed to reveal the truth in fairly objective ways. So you would think that it would be protected where scientists could simply debate issues when they had a difference of opinion. But instead, what's happened is we've seen this incredibly massive censorship campaign of scientists. It started in 2020 when scientists were deplatformed and, all their YouTube videos were removed. Then we had the creation of the Dirty Dozen list, which was a complete fabrication, but they took the highest profile people and then they said, okay, well, these guys got tens of thousands of followers. We better make sure, millions of followers, we want to make sure that they do not get good coverage at all, ever. So we're going to call them the Dirty Dozen.
So who are you hoping will be able, COVID index, you're hoping this will be for the layperson, for the scientists, for anyone? And for someone like I was talking about earlier, someone like me who just doesn't trust anyone anymore, I would see that. Like Brownstone Institute, I trust. CDC, sorry, CHD, I trust. Very different, very different. And I will hope to have more trust in general with Kennedy at the helm at HHS. For now, a source like this is something that I would absolutely trust 100% more than anything in the establishment. That's just, they're dead to me at this point. But so what are you hoping, how are you hoping this will be used?
Yeah, first of all, I trust the CDC more than the FDA now, but I no longer call the CDC the Centers for Deception and Control. And I no longer call the FDA the fascist drug administration,
Mm-hmm.
but they got problems.
Yeah.
They're still trying to toe the line and not to appeal to the academic community,
Yep.
as well as to not cross the biopharma complex too much,
Mm-hmm.
because that biopharma complex is so powerful. As you can see right away with the recent vaccine policy change, you immediately see
Mm-hmm.
how they are disparaging the CDC
Mm-hmm.
and the FDA. So it's a tricky thing to be
It
in
is.
those agencies right now, and I have a lot of sympathy for Makari, Bhattacharya.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing the best they can,
Mm-hmm.
but there are problems. So
Mm-hmm.
going back to your question, I think that the COVID index can be extremely helpful for many purposes. For educational purposes, first of all, to educate people about how they were misled, how they were deceived, how distortion occurred of the perception of risk benefit of the products. And, I would say it's also helping to pull the veil back on issues like the origins of the virus. Was a bioweapons experiment product that was originally, the research was done at UNC Chapel Hill while I was there as a doctoral student. And then it was transferred it was outsourced to the Wuhan lab because bioweapons research is illegal in this country. So it was outsourced to China to finish up the bioweapons research part of it. And then it was leaked from the lab. Now, even just saying this right now, people would be, no. That can't be true. Can't be true. No. RFK Jr., he wrote the Wuhan cover up, but that can't be true because that was RFK. So maybe they could check out the COVID index and see what articles are there that help support that. So that's an example of education, right? It could serve that educational purpose, possibly at the college level, or at the graduate level, so that grad students could go back and let's make a dissertation of this and turn that into a book maybe. Legally, I think the legal applications are powerful as well. Many people are dealing with vaccine injuries. We document that extensively in the COVID index. Of course, the papers I wrote, like about myocarditis, the inflammatory heart damage, exposing the three main myths that are associated with myocarditis, which are that the infections cause more myocarditis than the injections. That's number one myth.
Right.
That the infections cause more severe and frequent severe myocarditis than the injections. And then the third one is that the risk benefit calculus favors the vaccines, the mRNA one. So those three things I've addressed in the myocarditis paper, which got presented at the U.S. Senate hearing on the corruption of science in federal health agencies by Dr. McCullough. And I was sitting right behind him during the hearing. It was very exciting. Ron Johnson received that information. I met Ron Johnson afterwards. And so this is an example of a signal that came up in 2021. The CDC announced that myocarditis was a signal, a serious harm of these shots in 2021 first came up in the military with military guys who were working out, doing vigorous activity, and they would develop myocarditis and have a heart attack, or and then it was shown on the athletic field. We had 10 times more sudden cardiac arrest in competitions after 2021 than we had in all previous years in terms of average per year, right? So, and this is really good data. It's not an exaggeration. That was 10 times, is based on very good data. So these are problems that all people hear about them and go, well, how do I verify that? Well, they could go to the COVID index and they could do a search on myocarditis and they could see, wow, look at these papers that are actually very contrarian, based on my previous assumptions of what was so-called truth, So then, so legal cases could be strengthened by referring to a lot of the papers that we synopsize in this great database. It's not really a database. It's a collection. It's a compendium of mostly counter-narrative papers and documents. So it's very, very helpful. And I hope that people will use it and not rely on artificial intelligence, because I could see you groaning.
Yes.
Yeah, because this is one of the most insidious
Mm-hmm.
forms
Mm-hmm.
of mind control that we're dealing with right now, as you
Yep.
know.
Yep.
And there are so many different AIs now,
Mm-hmm.
and they're all mostly pro-vaccine, and they're still perpetuating the myths that are
Yeah.
associated with the vaccine ideology. And so this is a big problem. And that's why I think the COVID index is actually a counterpoint to that,
Mm-hmm.
because people don't realize what capture really means, but
Right.
it really captures group think. That's what it does. It captures group
Right.
think. And so, yeah, why
Well,
don't you comment on that?
no, yeah, no, it's just to your point. It's now to be a critical thinker, you are some radical dissident who
Right.
just why can't you just accept that there are people in charge who are experts and you're not one of them? And I'm thinking, just please just peel back a layer or two. Who funds these people?
Mhm.
The study that you're so sure is correct. Do you know anything about the methodology? What was their operational definition? Was the study, I mean, in some of these papers, they'll start with one hypothesis, they'll start the methodology, they'll change their outcome, what they're looking for midstream. I mean, like to your point about the Pfizer papers, and I purchased that whole document. It's a big fact tome from Dr. Wolf because I was like, someone's going to just destroy this. I want to have it extant. I want to have it in
Mhm.
my bookshelf.
Yeah.
And yeah, and they destroyed the control group halfway through the Pfizer
Mhm.
clinical trial.
Mhm.
So, I
Now,
mean, these basic understanding of how we conduct experiments and how we then gather knowledge, it's just so out of control at this point. And then to your point about AI, it just drives me crazy. I'm thinking, I don't even understand AI really, except that apparently we keep feeding it information and then it tells us what's true and what we should believe. And I'm thinking, well, who's the person in Silicon Valley who first put this thought together that now is disseminated to all of us and then is being taught what to say back to us? Well, I don't know what their philosophy or their orientation toward anything is. How am I supposed to believe this? But yet people go, oh yeah, I just asked GPT and that's what they said. I'm like,
Well, we were using Google for a long time in the same way that people are now
that's
using
true.
AI. And Google was basically captured by the pharmaceutical
Yep.
industry, I don't know, 20 years ago, or, when it first came
Mm-hmm.
out, because
Mm-hmm.
it was a Bill Gates invention. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a great example of like how we got programmed
Mm-hmm.
to start believing, I've got this ginseng. I want to see what the side effects. Oh, I'll just Google it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what people don't realize is when they do that, they're getting an answer that is filtered through the lens
Right.
of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yep.
And it's designed to actually disempower people around self-care. It's designed to make people believe that natural medicine and natural therapies and
Mm-hmm.
natural lifestyles, going out in nature, eating natural food,
Mm-hmm.
not artificial food like junk food or stuff with lots of additives, you know, it's all of it is filtered to get people sick. Number
Mm-hmm.
one, to really undermine a lot of the natural movement, which I say natural because I believe that what's happened to humanity over the past 40 years is largely a process of artificialization. Now we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing it with the mind,
Mm-hmm.
with AI and extremely high level programming through social media,
Yep.
where you get, as of 2020, it really kicked into high gear, but it was already going strong for 2 decades. And in terms of mass programming. And so a lot of people have given away their authority. They've given away
Yep.
their sovereignty, their autonomy, personal autonomy. And so it wasn't a big stretch for people to say, oh, I'll just abide by these idiotic social distancing rules,
Right.
or I'm just going to, wear this mask, which had no benefit for the vast majority of the population because for reasons we don't even need to go into,
Right.
all of these people were primed for this kind of
Mm-hmm.
disinformation happening. And so again, the COVID index it helps make sense of how all of that happened, just as the papers that I've written, Lessons Learned and the myocarditis paper, and recently the hybrid harms paper, these help people make sense of the illusions that were
Mm-hmm.
created that are continuing to be perpetuated. And I'm really glad that the COVID index exists. Again, covidindex.science for people who want to check it out. It's a very important resource. I hope it continues. I know that Children's Health Defense is, dealing with a lot of pressure to move on, so to speak, because people are like, okay, enough of COVID. But I believe, and I'm sure you feel the same way, that we're talking about such an egregious social injustice that was done to our population, a psychosocial injustice that has to do with really such a mass deception and so much suffering that has happened that is easily eclipses. I think when the true numbers are eventually made public to everyone, they will see that the suffering and death that was caused by these mRNA shots far exceeds any damage that was actually caused by the infections. And the only reason that the infections, again, another lie. I mean, you and I could have spent the whole show talking about the lies. Another lie was that, that the deaths could be attributed to COVID. And I'll give you two examples that I just can't help sharing with you because I find them so amazing. One of my high school French teachers, amazing. I took advanced French when I was in high school. I also took it in college, and I love the language. And my French teacher in high school developed lung cancer about 4 or 5 years before 2020. And he was battling it with chemotherapy, and, it was obviously stage 4, very difficult situation when he eventually died with a positive PCR. So everybody is going, COVID. This was a COVID death. And everybody's saying how tragic that, it was in 2020 that he died. And now I had to remind everybody that he'd been fighting lung cancer for 6 years prior to that, and that he'd been on chemo for 4 of those years. And, it's just, but immediately people are like, that's COVID. And that's an example of, it's one of many. It's a more dramatic example. Another one was, an 82-year-old, also a teacher, died of, some cardiovascular issues, but he tested positive, PCR positive, and he was counted as a COVID death as well. Now, people die, in their 80s. And I don't mean to laugh about it, but often they do die in association with infections, so, but, average lifespan for most American men, what is it, like low 70s, I think. So it's a tragedy when an older person dies, but when you added the PCR positive thing, it suddenly became a tragedy, because they were tragic victims of the pandemic. And, so many of these deaths were just miscounted, and they're part of the propaganda that we now see, that over 1 million Americans died of COVID. It's absolute lie.
And the hospitals were incentivized to give those tests, even to random patients who were there for nothing having to do with any kind of COVID symptoms whatsoever, like you said, cancer, because they were getting enormous amounts of money if they had COVID cases.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that extends to if the death certificate reads COVID, if there's some sort of additional money that the family would get. I don't know to that extent, but I know there were many incentives in place to ratchet up the number of cases that could be considered COVID. And not to mention the PCR cycle threshold, I believe, was out of control, to where you could have had a random cold 15 years ago and it would show up as a positive for COVID. So there were people who had nowhere near anything akin to whatever that first alpha variant of COVID was, and yet they're testing positive for COVID.
Yeah, another interesting aspect of that testing positive thing is that if you had been exposed to SARS-CoV-2 and then you eliminated the virus, the remnants in your nose would give you a positive test. So people who had successfully eliminated the virus were counted as cases, were counted as positive cases. And you could have then been killed in a car accident and you would have been called a COVID death. And that happened a number of times, even people getting killed by gunshots who tested positive. But, something else you said, I think that the case counting was the big illusion from a scientific point of view. because, and I've said this many times, and probably a lot of your listeners are aware of it, but the CDC definition of being vaccinated was 2 weeks after the second shot, right? So if you had an adverse reaction to the shots prior to 2 weeks after the second shot, if you either had a heart attack and died, or you had some other major thing, you developed autoimmune disease, you were counted as not as vaccinated, but as unvaccinated. So you could have 2 shots and then 2 weeks after. Think of like the interval between the first and second shot. Sometimes it was months, a couple months, usually it was a lot shorter than that, but it didn't really matter, because the point is that the adverse reactions to the shots were being counted as unvaccinated. And this turned reality on its head.
Right.
It was actually fraudulent reporting of the data, and so many studies reported this. We've documented a really great book to check out is Fighting Goliath by Norman Fenton and his colleague, Neil, I believe is his last name, professors at Queen College in London, Queen's College. And, it's an amazing book, Fighting Goliath, because they document all of the ways that this was achieved at a scientific level through this manipulation. Like in early 2021, you had a lot of people who were still not injected yet, right? They might have received the first shot, but they hadn't received the second shot. So if they were elderly people, okay, this is very interesting. If they were elderly and they went into a hospital where they were, of course, not given proper treatment for COVID, they never got the early treatments for COVID. So they were already in a crisis situation. Then they die. They were counted as unvaccinated, even if they had 1 shot or 2 shots prior to the second, 2 weeks after the second shot. Now, doctors are looking at this and they're seeing a disproportionate number of people coming in who are unvaccinated, right? By that definition, they're unvaccinated. So they start to believe, we got to vaccinate as many people as we can. So that's the way it was in the first half of 2021. We had what was called the base rate fallacy, where we had a lot of people in the background who were not vaccinated, right? Because they simply hadn't gotten the shots yet.
Right.
They were being counted, and you created this distortion. And then by the latter part of 2021, you had people who were not up to date with the CDC's vaccine schedule. And so they too were counted. If you were not up to date, you were counted as unvaccinated,
Well, we had more unjabbed among us than we realized.
Right. And yet here's an interesting point about that is that from the standpoint of the immune system, you could make that argument that the immune system, because the immunity was waning so fast after the shots that, they were not up to date legitimately. But the problem with that definition is it forgets the fact that the spike protein is still being, generated en masse, and it's causing a lot of immune dysfunction and inflammation and causing problems, right? So that's how this thing got so twisted, is that people were so tunnel visioned on certain aspects of the narrative. And it was complex, I understand why a lot of doctors couldn't get it, because most doctors don't have enough training in epidemiology or biostatistics, so their understanding of these issues is very limited, and no offense to doctors. I mean, I have a lot of friends who are medical doctors, and I admire them tremendously for the work they do, and they're fantastic physicians. But scientific illiteracy existed at the medical community level, it was. And when you then combine it with the appeals to authority, believing in Rochelle Walensky saying this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated, and she's parroting what President Biden was saying, and President Biden's probably parroting what Fauci was saying.
Right.
It's a ripple effect of the appeals to authority coalescing with the scientific illiteracy. Or let's just put it this way, a lack of scientific literacy, because scientific illiteracy sounds like a really pejorative term, or I'm, denigrating the doctors. And I don't mean to be saying that. They're not illiterate. They're very literate. But a lot of these issues are very technical, and the 2-week rule everybody gets, the CDC rule. But then there's a lot of subtleties that go into looking at the methodologies, and you can see that the vaccine industry has worked really hard to publish lots of papers that make it look like these things are safe and effective when they are just not, you know.
Well, and
So again, COVID Index, great resource. Well, I'll come back to it so people go back to it, covidindex.science.
Yeah, and I hope it can be. And as we kind of round off the conversation, I hope it can be a source that can be enlightening. I've not had much success with people.
Yeah.
I think maybe because I took such a strong stance that now the psychology of it, once you've done something, you kind of you have a confirmation bias that's inherent to the choice you made. You want to surround yourself with people and information that validates what you did. And someone like me who took such a strong stance, even if you're starting to question now, you might not want to talk to someone like me and be like, I would not say I told you so, but one might think that I might come at them that way. But because even things that were so hard, there's one friend most friends didn't want to talk to me at all. Once those lines were drawn, even some of my dearest friends, we were just not talking about this. We'll talk about anything else, but we're not going to talk about this, which is sad too. Just thinking about, you talked about the overwhelming harm that has been done from the lack of trust now in our institutions and the establishment and in the CDC, FDA, so much overwhelming harm. It's even like we've been talking for over an hour and we've scratched the surface for all the many ways, many domains that were touched by this, again, lies and tyranny and propaganda. But the human relationship fallout from all this, the division, the families torn apart. You can't go to see your unvaccinated MAGA cousins for Christmas or it's nasty, nasty. Should we finally make amends with those unvaccinated people? All this it just gets me fired up, obviously. I've had, even when I would show some of these clips I would find with one friend who would discuss this stuff with me, things like you said, Michelle Walensky saying, get the vaccine. The virus will stop with you. You won't transmit it. Rachel Maddow says it from CNN or MSNBC, whatever she's on.
Right.
Biden said it. It will stop. You get the vaccine, it'll stop. You won't get the infection and you won't transmit it. And that was blown out of the water very early when the vaccine rollout was happening in 2021. And then, breakthrough infection. But at least I didn't die. I got COVID, but at least I didn't get hospitalized. So when I would show my one friend, she would just say, well, I don't remember that. I'm thinking, you watch MSNBC on the regular. How do you not remember this? Biden's your guy. How do you not remember this? So I've had I'm still trying to find common ground because we could talk about this, but we don't have time today, but I do feel that part of this, and I'm not sure what kind of agenda or who they are of which I speak, but that part of this was the propaganda campaign was to divide us. And pit us against each other so that we wouldn't look at Gates and whoever else is up there. I'm not even sure, but I'm open to who these people might be and to their nefarious agenda, which could be multiple for all I know. Depopulation is not off the table. Again, this is opening a lot of cans of worms, but I do hope the COVID index.
Sound like a conspiracy theorist. My God.
I think guilty. Let's go with that. Yeah. But I hope the COVID index can be something that could start to heal some of the division where we could find that common ground again. So thank you for your work.
Well, thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. And I just want to respond briefly to what you just said because it's such a emotionally charged topic is division and polarization that has happened. I feel like when the majority of the population chooses to embrace a certain narrative, a certain set of beliefs, a paradigm, you then, the minority, and I've never really known what it's like to be in a minority until this happened, the minority, now I know what it feels like, I think, in principle, theoretically at least, to be marginalized, ostracized, demonized, and scapegoated for something that was actually just an illusion, that was very, very artfully created, artfully manufactured, so that you could manufacture consent, not informed consent, to receive a product that is really part of a global experiment right now. So what I have come to is a few things that I'll just share with you briefly. One is that I want to consciously try to let go of the story around the psychosocial aspects of being ostracized and demonized and ridiculed for simply being skeptical and choosing to be critical and not accept what were basically authoritarian measures in a so-called free country, So, but I have to let go of that story, because if I don't, if I keep holding on to it, then of course I stay in the drama aspect of it. I never fully move forward beyond my ego, which I can tell you personally, the greatest thing that helped me was in 2018, I started meditating a lot, like every night for 2 hours.
Whoa.
A lot of meditation. Yeah. And I was rigorous with it. Like, the first 2 years, I think I only missed 1 or 2 nights out of the year. So I was really rigorous. My kids were like, "Dad, are you going off to meditate again?" Because I'd go off in the woods and meditate every night. And that really helped me get clear on the signals that were coming in that were distortions, and because when you get still in yourself and quiet in yourself, you can see through a lot of things. You can hear the deception, and you can see it more clearly. So I highly recommend meditation to people as a way to disengage from all of the noise and distortion, and to break up that static inside ourselves that has to do with all of the social media messaging and so forth. I'm no longer on any social media except for X, but people can find me at Nathan Mead, PhD. But that letting go of the story, cultivating stillness in yourself so that you can listen and see and hear more clearly what is true, at least intuitively. Because we have to cultivate our intuition, and we have to hold on to that intuition. It's really just as important. Einstein said this, both imagination and intuition being incredibly important to the scientific process, but that is really important. And then the last thing I would just say is I am mustering as much compassion as I can for the people who chose those shots, because they could be facing a very difficult path. And it's not pity, it's just compassion,
Yeah.
And I know you feel this too. And it's the more I remind myself that a lot of this was chosen out of ignorance, and it was chosen out of incredible pressure, especially the young people.
For sure.
The pressure that they faced was so great. But even the older people, the elderly, they were pressured into it. My mother didn't want the shots. She was pressured into it.
Yeah. My mom didn't even want to tell people in her Bible study, that she was unvaccinated, because she didn't want to deal with it, because she's in her 80s, and she knew her fellow 80-year-old, 70-year-old friends would look at her, "What? You want to get us all sick?" I mean, so
my mother never would have chosen the shot. She was unfortunately whisked off by a family member and forced into it. And then she developed, unfortunately, reactions to it that I'm not going to go into. But, it's just, So thinking about it in those terms, I just have to remember that, this was a difficult situation for many, many people.
Yeah. And no, and I appreciate that. And I do, in addition to compassion, I have some fear, because I have loved ones who I don't know how many jabs. I stopped asking. Well, I didn't want to ask because it became such a contentious topic. I didn't want to feel, I wasn't coming from a place of judgment. I was coming from a place of like, I think I'm listening and hearing things from experts that you're not, because you're looking at the conventional channels and I'm over here. And so mine was coming from a place of love and fear, frankly, which I know we shouldn't operate out of fear, but it was terrifying to me to think you're doing something and you're not getting informed consent. You're just not. Yeah. So anyway, that's a good point.
Interesting, isn't it, that they chose out of love too?
Yeah.
Because they thought that by, taking the mom and getting the mom vaccinated, that was out of love.
Yes.
Right. So it's really fascinating, isn't it?
And both were operating out of fear. The one friend I told you about, who we actually did a couple podcast episodes about it, right? And I think it was early 2022. So it was kind of in the thick of it. Yeah. And we talked about coming from a place of fear because they were fearful of the virus. And so let me get that shot, and I was fearful of taking an experimental product with no longitudinal studies. So we're both operating, which makes sense to us to appease our own area of fearfulness. Yeah. So I appreciate what you're saying about the compassion, and I also appreciate trying to take the step away from the drama of everything, because again, I'm not sure who's orchestrating what. Again, I'm not, or was it just this random perfect storm of entities that could capitalize on this? I don't know. But my rage, which I do need to give to God, and in my prayer life, which is my form of meditation, I need to give that, because that's allowing me to still be manipulated. And I don't want, like you talked about, I want sovereignty, and I want my responses to not be reactionary, but to be responding from a place of my principles and my values and the way that I want to move through life, honoring God and honoring my fellow man. Yes. So I appreciate that word. Thank you for landing the plane with that. And thank you for the work you're doing, and remind everyone of the COVID index, and just, do they need to get login information, or do they just hop on and start exploring?
Yeah, it's very easy to hop on and start exploring, and it's covidindex.science. It's, like I said, very easy to use, very searchable. You can find my papers there if you just go in and do a search for my last name, Mead, and start with lessons learned. Then the myocarditis paper, which is, do you know who John Campbell is, the British podcaster? He's a very interesting podcaster.
He's a physician too?
He's formerly, I think, a nurse practitioner, but he's a really interesting guy. And he called it the best paper written on the adverse effects of the shots. And the most recent paper is, I think it's called Compound Adverse Effects of the COVID shots and the infections. But it's the hybrid harms. So yeah, people can find all those papers there, and then they can find me on X at Nathan Mead, PhD. And it's really been a pleasure talking with you. I enjoyed it very much, Karen.
Oh, no, appreciate your time so much, and definitely very, very much appreciative of the work you're doing to get, like you said, that Rosetta Stone in place for in the midst of all this chaos. Thanks so much, Dr. Mead.
Thank you.
Love and Life with Dr. Karen and Pastor Elliot is produced by Tim May and executive producer, Dr. Karen Anderson-Abel. For more information about Love and Life, please go to loveandlifemedia.com.